Autopoiesis, which uniquely defines autonomous entities, unitary, individuated, and closed to input-output relationships, lacks characteristics essential to living organisms, like the fact that they are born, die, and survive through genetic phylums. Autopoiesis deserves to be rethought in terms of evolutionary collective entities which maintain diverse types of relations to alterity, or relations of alterity, rather than being implacably closed in on themselves. In such a case, institutions and technical machines appear to be allopoietic, but when one considers them in the context of the machinic assemblages that they constitute with human beings, they become ipso facto autopoietic. Thus, we will view autopoiesis from the perspective of the ontogenesis and phylogenesis proper to a mechanosphere superposed on the biosphere.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH, and we are giving patrons access to our Discord server. Taylor's running some amazing reading groups on some of the translation work he's done. And today we even had a guest join and answer some questions on non-philosophy. So if you're enjoying the show, please do consider sending us $1 a month on Patreon, and you'll gain access to that content. Those older episodes have been recorded and are available for patrons too. But today we're going to be joined by Timothy Jackson to discuss his work on Felix Guattari's Chaosmosis. But Timothy, it's really good to put a face to a name, or a name to a face. I don't know. Does it matter which way? I don't know if it matters, but it's good
I don't think it Good to see you too, man.
But we have...
Yeah, go ahead, Coop.
I was going to say, if you wanted to start us off with your philosophical origin story and maybe tell us a little bit about what it is you do per se. Yeah, pretty much you've got the ball and are welcome to run with it and take that in any direction that you'd like.
Yes, the life story. Always difficult to know where to begin, always difficult to know what is the absolute origin. I guess I grew up as a kid in a house that was, pretty diverse in terms of interests and influences coming from my parents. Dad is a geologist who later moved to the IT industry. Mom is an editor and a bibliophile. And so I grew up with a lot of exposure to nature and naturalism, and Dad's deep interest in geology and paleontology. So a sense of deep time. But also his personal obsession has always been scuba diving. So I was ridiculously privileged as a child to be taken to a lot of amazing places where Dad wanted to go diving and see as many sharks as he possibly could or whatever. And we, the kids were just sort of dragged along, but not exactly kicking and screaming. And so I just grew up spending a lot of time outdoors in nature, but then a lot of time indoors reading as well. And it was sort of always expected, I think, that I would go into a career in biology and just be a naturalist, not in the sort of metaphysical sense, but spend a lot of time, doing what I was doing as a kid anyway, like out in nature, observing organisms. And that's kind of all I've ever done professionally. Although, I mean, obviously I've done a lot of that in labs and other things, and we can get into that, but is work with animals and animal products and sort of study them and try to understand them. But I did have a real like a crisis in my late teens, maybe because I'd been on this path in such a kind of, I had a lot of other interests when I was a kid as well, but in a fairly monomaniacal way. And I'd actually worked as a research assistant coming straight out of high school. I took a year off. I moved to Singapore. I worked as a research assistant on some venom research projects there, and I sort of published my first peer-reviewed paper like when I was 18 and blah blah blah. And then I went back to do my undergrad science degree, and I was like, oh no, this is not exactly where I'm at or what I was hoping for. And so another big interest of mine had always been music, and also my dad is a very keen musician and a really good pianist, so I grew up playing a lot of music. And when I started to, become disenchanted with my science education initially, I drifted around a little bit. I went and did English literature and philosophy, and then that kind of didn't work for me. And so I jumped into a music degree. And I did end up completing a music degree. Even there, I bounced around in majors from performance to musicology and composition. But then when it came time to potentially pursue postgrad for music, I was like, but now I'm missing the science thing. So I actually, jumped back over, finished my science degree, ended up doing a PhD in evolutionary biology, biochemistry, and history and philosophy of science. But in particular, kind of picking up where I'd left things off, because I went back and did a PhD with the guy that I'd worked for as a research assistant in Singapore. So working on these kind of big questions in evolution of venom systems and venom components and things in reptiles. None of this sounds all that philosophical at this point, I suppose. I had always been reading philosophy in the background, and I had some encounters during my PhD and immediately before my PhD, which kind of forced me to recognize that even though I thought, I probably had the hubris of thinking that I had a really broad education because I had a degree in the humanities and a degree in the sciences, I was really undereducated in certain areas, and there were things that I was no longer questioning. So I had an encounter with a Russian PhD student who sort of awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers and made me realize that I needed to really study the history of philosophy, integrate in a lot more detail than I had to that point. And then at the same time, and I've talked to Taylor about this before, during my PhD, I was dragged into this debate amongst toxinologists about basically like what is venom, or even if we agree on a definition of what venom is, which organisms are venomous. And it just became apparent to me that everyone was arguing past each other, and that what they hadn't really considered was the nature of a functional trait like venom, of a function class, like what exactly is venom as a classifier. So it's a function class, which we can maybe get into because I think there's some relation there with abstract machines and things. And so that also threw me back onto, digging into philosophy of biology, trying to mediate this debate between all these old academics who were just at each other's throat. And that, I guess, again, spurred a turn, as I say, towards history and philosophy of science. That ended up becoming a chunk of my PhD. And then to just conclude this waffly and vacuous origin story, I think, I got very, very interested in general principles of evolution and ecology, general principles of biology in some sense, right? And I probably, just because of the way I've spent my life and also my educational background, I kind of had to understand everything that I was attempting to understand in terms of those principles, like they became my, undergirding diagrammatic schema. And so that, naturally led me in the philosophical domain to be interested in process relational philosophies. So, Whitehead, Peirce, etc. And then eventually, I guess that brought me in contact with, the kind of guys that you guys are really interested in. So Deleuze, Guattari, etc. And so what I found to get to, I guess, part of the point that we're going to talk about Guattari's Chaosmosis today, what I found in Deleuze and Guattari is a very deep understanding, I think, of a relational ontology, a process relational ontology, and even what I would think of as a Darwinian ontology. I don't think these guys necessarily thought of it that way. I think, like a lot of French philosophers in their milieu, including people like Simondon and obviously Bergson beforehand, they slightly misunderstood Darwin, or they conflated Darwinism or what it was to be Darwinian with what was then in vogue in biology, so a sort of neo-Darwinian synthesis, or an adaptationist program. So I think Bergson and Simondon, maybe following him, thinks of Darwinism as adaptationist. That's quite mistaken. But so what I think we get with some of these thinkers, particularly Simondon and Deleuze and Guattari, is people who are incredibly Darwinian, very, very deeply, profoundly Darwinian, but with perhaps not knowing that they are in some sense, right?
Historical geology was one of my absolute favorite classes that I have ever taken. I really loved the hell out of that class. I was just thinking about that since you mentioned your dad was in geology. Was what sort of work did he do, or was he an academic, or what was the kind of context for that? Just out
So
of
yeah, I mean, he was an academic up until like he finished honors, and then he published a couple of papers. But I guess as a lot of people do, and a lot of people were doing in the 70s, I suppose. Then, or yeah, I guess early 70s, he jumped straight to industry, and that industry was the oil industry at that time, right? So
Yeah.
he was in core analysis for a long time, right? So basically, a study of stratification, looking at rocks and layers of rocks to determine whether there were likely to be oil depositories underneath them, etc. And so he was in the oil industry for most of my early childhood, and that meant also that my parents and then us later have been living this kind of expat lifestyle, like very rootless cosmopolitan.
Right.
From really early on. So actually, my parents only got married so that Dad could take Mum to Texas, actually, which I think is where you are, Cooper.
Yeah.
With an oil industry job, because the company wouldn't pay to move a girlfriend, but they'd pay to move a wife, And then they were in West Africa and Norway, and then when I was born in the Middle East, and then back in England, because they are sort of partly English, except my mum grew up in Brazil. And kind of all over the place. And then the oil industry collapsed in the mid to late 80s, and that's when Dad jumped ship to IT, basically.
Gotcha.
And that's what brought us to Australia in the end as well, right? One of his IT roles.
No stranger to the oil industry, for sure. So, but yeah, I don't know where to start off. Maybe one of you two would be better poised. I've got a bunch of Dune shit that I can rattle off, and Timothy and I can have our own side conversation.
Yeah, we can slide into Dune.
There is some good. I do actually have, I think, germane stuff, but I always think that.
So is oil the spice? Is that the?
Well, you know what's weirdly actually is that So it seems like that would be the case, but supposedly Herbert said water.
Oh, right.
Water was really the stand-in, but I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah.
Anyway. I guess I would start, Tim. We could start with the move that Guattari is making, because he does two interrelated moves, right? With taking up autopoiesis from Maturana and Varela. One of the moves, I think it may be first, I say chronologically in terms of the reading, but it might come after the passage you read on page 40, 41, 39 and 40. I can't remember if he does this first or second, but when he brings up autopoiesis first, it seems like, if I recall, he challenges the fact that Maturana and Varela want to confine and constrict this notion to biological systems, right? And Guattari's like, well, no, in the way I understand it, it applies to technological, sociological, psychological, environmental, etc. Right. So he wants to take autopoiesis outside of a circumscribed regime, and maybe this is one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari do best in terms of their use of scientific ideas and importing them philosophically, which we call inexactitude, right? Or anexactitude, right? So there's a way in which you could modulate a notion from outside of philosophy, but give it a sort of different scope and vector. So he seems to do that first, and then in the passage that you read for our cold open, which I think is interrelated, he wants to shift from thinking about machines as allopoietic, right? That they're engaged in creating other things in the way in which we can think of, whether it be from the simplest of tools to to other even more interesting technical ensembles that, let's say, that Simondon analyzes. But he's trying to think about, there isn't, in his machinism, right, moving beyond vitalism mechanism, which takes up arguments as far back, if not before, of anti-Oedipus through Samuel Butler, etc. He's trying to think about autopoiesis on the machinic level, which cannot be restricted to the technical machine. And so I guess maybe we could start there and talk a little bit about autopoiesis. First, maybe if you want, you could say a few words about its role in its more strictly biological formulation, which obviously you would have plenty of knowledge and background on, and then we can think about the shift that Guattari is trying to bring out.
Yeah, no, it's a really good place to begin. I think there's a double critique here for sure. So
Okay.
on the one hand, the critique is that autopoiesis is not uniquely the mark of the living. So the technical objects is what you were articulating. The distinction between the allopoietic and the autopoietic is not kind of an absolute one for Guattari. So and I think that moves us in Simondonian direction. The technical object doesn't exist and certainly has no power of expression outside some machinic assemblage or some sociocultural context,
right,
with engineers and users and universes of value and all sorts of things that shape and determine, if we want to use that word, maybe we don't, but that shape what that technical object is for, basically. So an artifact has a purpose. It is for something, but it is not, that purpose is not intrinsic to the artifact. It's nested within these complex assemblages. And so when you zoom out from you might think of the technical object in isolation, and then it looks allopoietic. It's not self-making in itself,
right,
but it is nested in a broader autopoietic assemblage for, and it just can't be thought outside of that context. So that's part of the expansion of the term autopoiesis, which also ends up breaking down this distinction between allopoiesis and autopoiesis. But I think that even the kind of juicier part of the critique here, and the part that's particularly of relevance to some of my work, is that he is questioning whether or not even living systems, biological organisms, etc., are in fact autopoietic in the classic sense. And so when he talks about speaking of machines, he does sort of have an aside saying, we're not speaking about their autonomy, we're speaking about their particular powers of enunciation. So, what they can do, not the fact that they can do it in some completely self-governing way. And then he puts there again in as an aside, it's not an animal. But then if we generalize the conception that I think runs throughout this book, that subjectivation, so what it is to be a subject and how one kind of becomes the kind of thing that one is always through a set of diverse relations to alterity, right? So there's no subjectivation or individuation or whatever in isolation, right? There's no, strictly speaking, autonomy. Organisms do not fold implacably in on themselves, as he also memorably says, right? They are in these networks of relations, and they're not abstractable in some absolute sense from them. They wouldn't have the capacities that they have, or indeed, if we're thinking in terms of evolution and in terms of phyla, as he again says in that section that I read for the cold opening, their forms are the product of these relational assemblages. And so I will always say, like, biology is a science of relations, and ecology describes synchronic relations, synchronic relationality, and evolution is, broadly speaking, about diachronic relationality. And the two things actually intersect in the principle of selection, right? So selection is something that occurs, at a specific time in some sense, but it's what shapes the diachronic relationality over time. So, you can channel someone like Donna Haraway and her critique of autopoiesis, saying, nothing truly makes itself, right? So she substitutes sympoiesis as always a making together. And this obviously, again, erodes the distinction that Varela and Maturana are trying to make between allopoiesis and autopoiesis, and trying to say that what really is distinguishing about living systems, and how we can distinguish, like, the organic from the inorganic, or living systems from non-living systems, is precisely their autonomy. The fact that living systems make themselves and are self-governing and are operationally closed is part of this key distinction that Varela and Maturana are trying to make. And I think Guattari is undermining that from both directions. And if we get into the way this links into chemical ecology, I won't keep going on, but we can potentially go there next. I'm making strong arguments about the fact that there's kind of no way to sustain this view that organisms are operationally closed, because they are kind of constitutively open to exogenous operators, what I call exochemicals, but you can think of a toxin or a pheromone or all sorts of different things, the kinds of things that are studied in chemical ecology, often referred to as semiochemicals in that domain. Organisms are often, penetrated by these exogenous chemicals, which have a kind of informative or transformative or subjectivating, deterritorializing, reterritorializing, all this, fun Deleuze-Guattarian terminology that we can use in that context. And we can potentially, map in some detail these exochemical operators onto, Guattari's fourfold and other diagrams in this book. But yeah, basically, there's no way for organisms to maintain the kind of closure that autopoiesis implies or diagrams. It's very abstract, essentially. Autopoiesis is itself a very abstract diagram of what an organism is, which describes
in the classical sense, in the Varelan realm.
Yeah. And I mean, Varela goes a long way even from that. He ends up in this place, organism, a meshwork of selfless selves and things like that. So
Okay.
Does end up really eroding the original definition of autopoiesis himself. And so it becomes we can say that autopoiesis is something that organisms do, like, they do set up boundary conditions and things that they make are conditions of their ongoing capacity to keep making themselves and stuff. So yeah, there's some work for autopoiesis to do here, but when it's deployed kind of rhetorically or even definitionally to mark this hard apparent boundary between living systems and non-living systems, it can't really do the job they originally wanted for it to do. And yeah, again, Guattari is kind of attacking that from both directions. Like, not technical objects are in autopoietic assemblages and can't be understood in any other way, but also organisms are machinic. Basically, they are also embedded in broader networks and couldn't be understood in any other way either. You would never be able to explain why an organism is the way that it is by abstracting it and saying, oh, well, it just makes itself. Even the cell, right? The cell that an organism begins with is a bequest from its lineage, right? So it is minimally open to its own lineage. this is an origins of life question. We don't really know how these things precisely began, but we know for organisms, which are deeply nested in very ancient evolutionary lineages, that they get a lot of this capacity to keep making themselves from a history of self-making or whatever, but not exactly. Systems that they're inheriting a lot of those capacities. So any individual organism, even when we take out the synchronic layer of ecology, certainly doesn't make itself in the absence of a history of organisms that it is the thin end of the wedge of, or
That sounds a lot like the Ruyerian mnemic themes that Coop and I discussed last week when we did the embryogenesis essay that I shared with you, Tim. Coop,
Yeah.
I think you were going to jump in, buddy.
Oh, I just kept thinking about, what was it, annexed milieu?
Oh,
Or
yeah,
like
yeah.
kind of difference between, or at least maybe a surface level way to just make a distinction between, I don't know, organic machines and technical machines, or what have you, right? Like in some simple example, like a hammer versus a human, right? Like you can see the human has this like memory, this ability to access knowledge, to reproduce its own existence, where a hammer, at least not directly, but certainly you could think how a hammer would reproduce itself by sort of giving shelter to a human being and so forth. And so in that way might have, maybe that blows up that, or draws attention to that distinction, or the maybe lack of distinction between allopoiesis and autopoiesis.
One of the
Yeah.
things. Oh, go ahead, Tim, if you were going to jump in.
Well, all I was going to say initially is that one way of conceptualizing tools is as components of the extended phenotype, this Dawkinsian term, one of his more useful contributions of an organism, right? And so they do, in a sense, just to riff off what you were saying, Cooper, they get themselves reproduced just because they happen to be very useful. But in some sense, that's how things work in general in evolution, right? There's an interesting distinction, an important distinction to make between a tool and a trait, and we can get to that. But there are also principled, similarities, basically. It depends on the degree of abstraction, basically. But sorry, yeah, go Taylor.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, just a few pages before on 37, a few pages before your cold open, where what I think is interesting, and we mentioned this, you and I, we were all talking before the show started, and I was saying how, Chaosmosis is interesting because it almost feels like Guattari is writing at a fever pitch, as though he knew, he may not have many years left. I mean, obviously he was in his early 60s ish, but he's doing a lot of condensing, a lot of synthesizing, a lot of harkening back to earlier work. And one of those that is interesting, I believe it was first published in 65, Machine and Structure, the essay that, no, it wouldn't have been 65. Couldn't have been 65. Yeah, it would have been 68, 69. Any case, he brings up reinforces and replays the distinction between structure, which, and I quote, is haunted by a desire for eternity, and is based on a principle of homeomorphism, versus what he is calling the machinic element, or the machine, right, which always depends on exterior elements. It's a complementarity not just with man who fabricates it, but with other virtual or actual machines, a non-human enunciation of proto-subjective diagram. I only bring this up because I know that you, Coop, you and I have talked about this, and Tim, you brought it up in our chats earlier in the week, where this reminds me of this institutional death drive that Guattari is putting forth and with Deleuze and Anti-Oedipus, where he's kind of suggesting, similar to the way in which they can suggest that, schizophrenia as process, there's a way of halting it, there's a way of making it circle around a void, or indefinitely prolonging it, that can render that then leads to, as a fallout or an aftermath, the production of the the schizophrenic catatonic subject, right? Once the process is sort of halted artificially. And I think that I think there's something similar going on here in his definition of structure as this desire for eternity versus what he's saying, the machine has a desire for abolition and breaking down. It does feel like Guattari not only is talking about, again, we're wrong if we think of structures as something material, like in our wall or like the building blocks of houses, or we think of machines as merely technical machines. He does seem to be, with the notion of institutional death drive, for example, he does seem to be thinking about this on levels of collectivity and different ways of forming social groups. This is why I think he refers back to start and serialization, because he is, I think, even though he doesn't use the terms, at least in this early part of the work, maybe later it comes off and I might have missed it, but the notion of subject groups and subjugated groups, right? There's a sense in which one privileges the machine more so than structure and vice versa. And this is I guess the question would be, would it be that conceiving machines allopoetically instead of autopoetically would be to sort of make a similar mistake, that they're merely structural partes, extra partes formations? Is this part of the argument about this appropriation of Maturana and Varela's initial idea?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting partly from what you were saying, I mean, a lot of different things, is that to treat the technical object as allopoetic, as sort of isolated in some way. Although I think, Simondon is always really lurking in the background of these conversations, and he does. One of the things he says about a technical object is that it's sort of infinitely or indefinitely abstractable, right? Like it can be taken out of a context and inserted into another context. And that is actually also really important for the way that I think about these exochemicals, toxins, and the like, and that they have their disruptive effects. And in fact, they work as machinic elements because when they are transported from one context to another. But that would be potentially to leap ahead. But treating the tool or the technical object allopoetically does seem to be, and therefore treating it as a kind of pure structure in some sense, is neglecting its machinic genesis, right? So is neglecting the account of how it came to be the way that it is, why it has even the structure that it has. This doesn't come from nowhere, right? It has a specific contextual, it's part of a technical lineage. It has specific purpose, and it's maintained for particular roles, all of that kind of stuff. So it can be considered in this more machinic way, rather than, again, treating the structure as some kind of, abstract universal that doesn't have a genetic account associated with it. I mean, I think one of the interesting things maybe in this book, which I've wondered about its relation to machine and structure, or the kind of, I guess, nearly 30 years of development of Guattari's thought through the relationship with Deleuze and all of that, is that I think in the machine and structure essay, it's machine and structure, like he's got machine and structure side by side. Whereas somewhere in this book, he actually says it's the machine in opposition to structure now.
Yes, yes.
Sort of sharpened the distinction in a certain way. But I do think of this again as related to something that Simondon says about the relationship between structure and operation, and that structure is essentially the residue of past operation. So again, of course, Simondon is always thinking about this ontogenetic account of things. Structures don't come from nowhere. They're not preformed. They're not fully formed. You understand them or can potentially explain them in the way the configuration, the structure itself, on the basis of these genetic accounts, and he's always trying to shift our attention in towards that. And so I think it's like structure. Basically, even when we go to machine in opposition to structure, it's not to say that there aren't structures, obviously. It's just to say that they don't have the same, ontological heft to them in some sense, or position to them, because they are in some sense the inert result of a process of ontogenesis. And so even the halting of a schizogenic process of heterogenesis resulting in a structure haunted by a desire for eternity and homeomorphism, like an endless repetition of the same, that is still like, to think about it in abstract terms as structure is to neglect to consider the forces of subjectivation or subjugation in this case that are in fact keeping it in this repetitive state, that are halting or preventing its capacity for ongoing heterogenesis. So it's not that it's simply inert and sitting there, it's that something is actually keeping it in that very, that relatively or apparently static or homeomorphic state. This can lead on to go back to a discussion of autopoiesis and one of its potential difficulties with the process of adaptation itself. So if organisms are, so basically in Maturana's original conception, you have an organism that is constructing itself, that basically has an abstract machine or a diagrammatic schema that it is continually repeating, and the external world ends up being a source of perturbation. So when the external world pokes that autopoietic organism, it destabilizes it, but the process of autopoiesis then will be a process of repair and snapping back to that homeostatic state, like trying to recapitulate something that there's been you've been bumped out of that state and you're trying to recapture it, as opposed to a more, machinic conception in which what's going on is a constant self-differentiation, a self-deviation from that homeostatic state, so that homeostasis even becomes somewhat of a misnomer. So again, I think that critique of homeomorphism and homeostasis is something that does resonate with the critique of autopoiesis, and a lot of different theories or perspectives in theoretical biology, from things like the organizational account to the free energy principle, which are based on a particular cybernetic conception of homeostasis, of a capacity of a system to keep returning to its kind of self-determined, preferred state of operation, as opposed to something that is able to do that in a kind of contingent way, but because it is continually differing from itself. And then I think, to go back to what Coop was saying, and key differences between non-living and living systems, or like physical and vital individuation in Simondonian terms, and the importance of the annexed milieu, right? I love, Simondon's discussion of how vital individuation is a kind of deferred, always open, never complete. So there's no actual final target state in some sense. So he refers to it as a neotenic, which is a juvenile form of physical individuation, which does in some sense have a final outcome, whereas vital individuation doesn't have a final outcome. And how it achieves that is by maintaining more of this pre-individual charge within itself, right? That's how a vital system continues to differentiate in an ongoing manner. And there are lots of really fascinating and principled ways we can figure that with empirical examples from biology, but maybe we'll get there.
I guess three things, and I'll try to be quick. One would be the accent that Guattari puts on machine and structure. It's not absolutely isomorphic with the pairing that Simondon makes between structure and operation, right? For him, he wants to see cybernetics pushed to the point where it's no longer this question of uniting or unifying two different sciences of structure, but moving to an operatory mode. So there's an interesting way in which Simondon tries to, just as structure was overemphasized, and as we know, not just in France, but throughout in various disciplines, and not just in philosophy, obviously, or linguistics, or we could cite all the people that even Deleuze does, and it's even further back, right, in mathematics. But you could think of all the moves of structuralism. So Simondon tries to, from the cybernetic point of view, tries to compensate by emphasizing this overlooked aspect of operations. Two, the other thing would be what you were saying about this question of a contingent homeostasis that is sort of open to shifting and not merely repeating the same, could very well, I think, for Guattari especially, be brought into mind with how Freud too is thinking about homeostasis. Yes, before the birth of Wiener's cybernetics, but cybernetics had existed before Wiener uttered the word, right? It's but Freud consistently has a kind of, more or less, he gestures towards the openness, but he's trying to think in a simplifying way about the unconscious as this, in principle, the psychical apparatus as maintaining a kind of homeostasis, specifically with the intensities it's having to deal with and discharge. And then the third thing I would say is, what's interesting about another way of bringing Simondon and Guattari together would be, just as I brought up the institutional death drive, which I think Guattari sees as a creative principle for collectivities, that they can be sort of always mortal and never try to eternalize themselves in such a way as to affirm power in the wrong-headed sense of pouvoir, as they can assert a kind of will to power where they can go to the end of what they can do, and literally end in both sense, right? They can also end and be provisional. With Simondon, you brought up the neotenic aspect of individuation in living systems, and one of the terms he comes up with, and I believe he develops this word. I don't know if it's his unique neologism. He might be drawing from somebody else, but he talks about the way in which the living, in its, as you said, in remaining in touch with its pre-individual milieu, with its associated or annex milieu, as Coop brought up, and it's drawing on its pre-individual charges. As it individuates, Simondon sees it layering, unavoidably layering in this process of what he calls amortization. There's little bits of death that are wound up in the living being that is a part of the process of aging and a part of the process of just this quote unquote natural course. So there is a kind of, if for Simondon, there is a kind of death drive in amortization. It's not something that is necessarily, again, this negative principle, but just it's the price to be paid for the ongoing individuation that the living being is subject to. And to a certain extent, I mean, like his favorite example of the crystal, to a certain extent, there is a fact that yes, the crystal can more or less indefinitely extend out if it retains if the germ from which it concresces, is still submitted to the mother liquor, the pre-individual milieu that allows it to keep drawing on the potentials to crystallize. But to a certain extent, we know that that's, even if it's theoretically possible, it's not necessarily going to take place outside of artificial conditions. So there's something similar, I think, with amortization in Simondon's sense, and I don't think he sees it as something negative, especially given, Tim, the emphasis you've been placing on Darwin. There is a sense in which the amortization process, the fact that death is sort of interlaced in life, that's the provisional impetus for reproduction of the species, and therefore various other kinds of differentiation.
Absolutely. Yeah, so memory is super important. Inheritance. Inheritance is the third part of the Darwinian triad, right? So, variation, selection, inheritance. So what is inherited is, potentially amongst other things, but is structure. And so structure acts as an enabling constraint on further differentiation. So I think, some people would say, and it'd be interesting to gauge your response to this, but I guess it's a common criticism of Deleuze and Guattari in some sense that they neglect the importance of or value of the same, right? So they're big on difference, and big on ongoing differentiation, but don't necessarily give enough. I don't think this is necessarily a fair criticism, to be honest, at least not from, 1,000 Plateaus onwards, because I think there the account of stratification in Geology of Morals shows us that at least on the ontological level, aside from perhaps their axiological commitment to ongoing differentiation, they recognize the key importance of, and inevitability, obviously, but of stratification, and therefore of the inheritance of structure that enables a further ongoing differentiation. There's a lot to say there. I love that you brought up the quote unquote Simondonian death drive as Jean-Hugues Barthélemy describes it in that really, really nice essay in what is it, Simondon, Being and Technology, that collection.
Yeah.
Love that essay. He has his own translation there, and he obviously he chose not to. So amortization in your translation, that's the literal translation of what Simondon. Yeah. So Barthélemy says deadening, but that obviously doesn't really count. Or whoever's translated, in fact,
right. Whoever translated it. It's got the word death in it more.
Justin Clemens, so it's an Aussie, in fact.
Okay, yeah, and Clemens is not he's by no means he had a reason for doing it. He's not it's not that he wouldn't know how to read French. I think that it's a question of proposing for me, I'd rather stick with as close to the French, because deadening, yes, I think that just, but see, that's the thing, right? It puts it overemphasizes what's going on, right? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I like that you've preserved the kind of neologism aspect, because it forces us to really think about what, both what might be novel in what Simondon is saying, and just that, we may need to rethink this aspect of organisms. Although I also think, and this is, I think I've said this to you before, Taylor, but there's a connection between this quote unquote Simondonian death drive, or is it a death drive, or is it just the inevitability of a certain kind of death as the byproduct of the life drive, right? Of the ongoing heterogenetic drive. There's something very don't want to throw around the word archetypal too readily, but there's something like perennial almost about this kind of image, that it accords with the notion that we'll find in a lot of different initiation contexts, that something about the child, for example, has to die in order for the adult to emerge, right? So a metamorphosis has to be undertaken. Something about the larval form must die so that it can be rearranged for the imago to emerge. That makes it sound like a two-stage process, which is obviously not where we want to go here. But you would find this notion in a lot of different philosophies, I would say, of something like contemplative philosophies, for example, or philosophies that were concerned with the passage of ego death or psychic catabasis. Catabasis being, the journey to the underworld and all of that, which is just such a perennial image. That so many of these enlightened sages, for example, Empedocles and Pythagoras and blah, 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 had to go to the underworld and come back. And that's a perennial image of the shaman, right? The shaman goes to the other side, is transformed by their encounter with the spirits or whatever it is, and then comes back and brings the knowledge. But there's this kind of movement there, like a psychic movement of ego death or whatever, that then opens up for the possibility of further change. So to diagram that, it's like if the ego is a kind of dissipative system or attractor selector in the psyche, so it's a structure in some sense, even though it's very dynamic, but it's a virtual governor. It's constraining or canalizing the ongoing development of the psyche. That kind of has to die in order for novel degrees of freedom to act, or novel lines of flight or whatever, to actually be discovered and to emerge. To bring this back to Guattari and chemical ecology, and what I'm trying to do with that, and even to a bunch of stuff they say in 1,000 Plateaus about the machinic element as differentiated from the machinic assemblage, and the machinic element that goes into the assemblage with a set of cutting edges, and deterritorializes it essentially to open up this additional positive lines of flight. This is a kind of, like, again, the death of the old economy, the old way of organizing things, the old set of habits that has to occur in order for the system's own, like, intrinsic capacity to differ, its own intrinsic generative potential, or its plasticity, we might say, to be liberated so that it can reorganize itself. So you need a disruptor to come in and kill some stuff, or to break what is over determining the whole psychic economy. And we don't have to think about psyches here, is the point. This can be you can think about this in very, very molecular terms, or of course you can think about disruptive pharmacology, and we can link that to shamanic healing and all these things. Drugs have been involved in a lot of these processes, but you can think about disruptive pharmacology. The exochemical, the pharmacological agent, is this machinic element that is a paradigmatic alterity in Guattarian terms, comes from outside the assemblage with a set of cutting knives, kills a bunch of stuff to enable the thing to keep growing in some kind of open manner. I mean, that's probably drawing a fair few things together, but I think that is another way probably of linking the institutional death drive of Guattari, Deleuze and Guattari, to the amortization in Simondon, as you were doing, to this machinic operation of an exogenous pharmacological agent, whether that's a toxin or some kind of effector molecule. There are tons and tons of amazing examples in biology we could speak to, or indeed a drug. And something we might get to then is a distinction between normative and disruptive pharmacology that I like to make, which is super relevant, not just to the specific molecule, because one molecule, again, abstracted from its operational role, taken out of any given assemblage, can have either normative or disruptive operational capacities. It's very much context dependent what it ends up doing. I don't know if that's trying to draw too many things together too quickly, but
no, that's great. Coop, are you going to jump in, brother?
I was just thinking about the sort of catabolic elements of capitalism itself, that, right, like the notion of creative destruction with respect to markets and whole verticals and what have you, right? Like the way that capitalism is not particularly necessarily married to any particular structure in terms of the commodities that it produces. Right. But there's oftentimes, right, this is the whole cycle, boom and bust cycle, right? Like we have to clear out the dead detritus and reassemble that capital, and like shake up the shaker, so to speak, or roll the dice again or something like that.
One thing too is the notion of amortization, which Simondon emphasized. It's not the degradation of the organs. It's not just cell death or zooming out, organ. It's something essential to the process of individuation. There's a, and this is how the conclusion of Ilfie ends, with Simondon arguing about the individual is opposed to this absolute of eternally existing beings, and he makes a whole argument about that's not relevant here, not directly, but I do think that it gets us back to the fact that if the living being, like I mentioned with the crystal, for example, whether or not this is a good or fair to the crystal, if the crystal is at least on the whole more structural, that's why it can continue indefinitely given certain conditions, right? It doesn't layer death in the deadening or amortization process that Simondon sees as essential in the ongoing process of living individuation. So I do think that there's like, because he's able to emphasize it, he only uses the word 4 times. I think it's really like 2 pages out of the whole book, but it really reemphasizes that link with Guattari and this notion that the machine is shaped by a desire for abolition. The emergence is doubled with breakdown, catastrophe, the menace of death. I do think that testifies to this interesting link, and that it's a positive. I think for Simondon, it's a positive thing, and not necessarily something that's negative or merely external that has to be fought off. Right? Like, I think that that's kind of also similar to like Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus when they talk about like how capitalism, that which fucks up all other modes of valorization, is what comes from without, but it seeps up from within, right? There's this interesting similarity there where sure, we have processes of warding it off, of anti-aging. There's a whole, speaking of capitalism, Coop, there's a whole billion-dollar industry, right, surrounding this. But I think for Simondon, it is something that's positive. Just for Guattari, it's something positive. And I do think it's interesting that Deleuze in his seminars is very key on dismissing the death drive as something abhorrent. I think he means it more so, at least in the specific form it takes in Freud and then Lacan. And then, as we know, we've talked about this, every analyst has their own spin and variation of a theme on the death drive, right? To the point where it's almost a meaningless, nonsensical phrase where it can stand for anything. I think for Guattari, it's a very concrete thing when it comes up in Anti-Oedipus, and when we see it still remaining as a definitive mode of describing the machine and the machinic aspect that this and again, maybe death drive's not even good for it anymore, but maybe amortization could apply just as well to what Guattari is describing in the machine. So yeah, if the living being were merely structure, I don't think we would be able to have this discussion that Guattari is doing, that we've been talking about, of then autopoiesis and machine would be absolutely divided there. And I think that's where Simondon is not yet as radical as Guattari. When Simondon talks about machines, he is thinking, is obviously not thinking in the sense in which Guattari is, which is fine. I mean, I say it's fine, but it's just that you have to find the machinic elements in Simondon outside of the places where he talks strictly just about machines or uses that word, because Guattari has so estranged it from what we are used to thinking, right, in our everyday, even in the laboratory or in the forge. Like he's made the machine and the machinic something that is completely unrecognizable and takes a total shift in our perception.
Yeah, he goes wild, but Simondon certainly, as you know very well, he takes a lot of concepts from biology.
Yes.
when he wants to understand, the genesis of technical objects, right? And I think that that's not coincidental. He still, of course, I mean, it's obviously not coincidental, but he certainly wants to make a difference. And I think Guattari goes a little bit further, yes. But I think it is important, I guess, here, if we were going to pursue that, to examine the reasons why, Simondon uses all of these biological analogies in order to understand the genesis of technical objects. I think there's so much to say in response to all the stuff you're saying. I think, with the crystal, isn't it just the case that the crystal is in fact not on its border, right? On its border, it's still undergoing individuation, right? So that's where it's transducing still, but inside there's not amortization so much as just dead. It's dead,
It's dead in so far as it's beyond or beneath. Yeah. It's beneath life and death, right?
It's the product. Well, it's the product of quote unquote life. I mean, someone like Peirce would use the term life, or indeed the term mind, somewhat in this way. What the characteristics of life is this ongoing heterogenetic process of evolution of habit taking, but then habit retaking. But a habit that is taken and then is fixed, that's actually a fossil, right? That's dead, but it is the product of life, and it is, it becomes a memory, well, it's a habit, and that enables, as we said before, that is a kind of enabling constraint on further constructive evolution. That's why evolution is constructive, like as Paul Valery says, I think it's Paul Valery, isn't it? Like, time is construction, but those things, the structure itself that is deposited or accreted is not itself living anymore. And the thing that characterizes the living system as opposed to the crystal is that process of, let's say, amortization, but ongoing individuation remains, internal to the system, like it's continually going on, not only at the border, not only at that, in that liminal zone, the interaction or relation between the system and environment, but it's continually going on inside it. And then that becomes the link again back to the machinic and what you were saying, the machine works by breaking down. It's constantly internally kind of breaking itself, or it's constantly internally excessive in relation to any sort of reference frame of, like, the completed individual phenotype of the moment before, right? The previous iteration. And so we can look at these things like at a lineage level, you could obviously start to draw in things like, genetic mutation, but in development itself, and ongoing individuation, which is happening all the time and never stops until we are in fact dead. There are all of these processes that we think of within organisms as spontaneous, that are constantly generating difference from, the organism itself, when we abstract a kind of, completed representation of a phenotype from the organism, or an organization, indeed. So the organism is not just not organizationally closed, it's kind of open to itself organizationally, because there are things like stochastic gene expression going on all the time, right? So gene expression is slightly stochastic. So the amount of gene products like proteins that are produced in any given tissue are always fluctuating just a little bit, right? They're not fixed, even though there is a particular target phenotype for a particular tissue type, a particular cell type, and it has to remain constrained within certain boundaries. Otherwise, it might fail to be itself, which could, of course, be catastrophic for the organism. But there are contexts in which these constraints get loosened, and that's part of what goes on with evolvability and plasticity in general, is the loosening of constraints on a fundamental difference, right? So the difference itself, or the stochastic gene expression in this case, cannot actually be eliminated. Like, you cannot regulate gene expression so well that it will not be stochastic. It's intrinsically stochastic. Similarly, and Jean-Jacques Kupiec makes a lot of hay with this, Taylor, molecules and their interaction propensities, their propensity to stick to any other molecule, are also not, he will say, stereospecific, right? They don't just stick to one thing and have a determinate outcome. They're very profligate. They're very prolific in their stickiness. They will stick to lots of other things and potentially modulate them. let's not forget molecules are themselves moving in Brownian motion, both within and between cells, right? And then, just jumping through a bunch of layers, go to the brain and look at spontaneous brain activity. And kind of at all these levels, a biological system is just full of like arbitrary, random, stochastic, whatever term you want. All those terms are problematic, but spontaneous activity that's always just going on. It's always differentiating itself from itself or differing from itself. It's always excessive in this sense, and that's what gives it its capacity to respond to difference in the outside world. Actually, right? That it's not fixed. That some selector can. Some selective event or selecting event can happen in the external world, and it can elicit and amplify some subset of that intrinsic variation and be like, okay, now I need to be this right now, or I need to be that right now. And I've got those degrees of freedom because I'm always different from myself. So if you just think about, spontaneous brain activity and learning, like in some sense, my words are currently canalizing your spontaneous brain activity, right? You've got this little excess shimmer that's always going on there, and words act as selectors essentially to kind of say, okay, this is the subset of things, like to the extent that we're capturing each other's attention, this is the subset of things to pay attention to. And that's how this ongoing process of constructive learning goes on. It is predicated on the machinic element. It's predicated on the processual, but again, in some ultimate sense, if we want to go there, the differential aspect of the thing is what gives it its capacity to continually generate novel structures, essentially. And I think that the issue always becomes when the structure is abstracted from that, or the form, let's say, because I think, you mentioned cybernetics and things earlier, Taylor, and we can talk about exactly how this operates in cybernetics, and even at the level of the formalisms, which are based on, the development of probability theory by people like Bernoulli and Laplace, who were determinists, who took for granted that there was a predetermined state space that a system was navigating, or indeed that our probabilities were subjective. I mean, we could go there, but you can also just go to Plato, and then obviously Aristotle in the way, and the development of hylomorphism, but the way forms as eternal structures operate in those ways of thinking. So the problem, I think, again, is always when those forms are taken out of the immanent process of formation, and kind of taken to preside, transcendently or whatever over it, as opposed to, again, being immanent products of it. And then I guess if we were going to go death drive, one thing that's interesting I mean, it came up for me at least in reading Guattari's discussion of the, Fort Da example, the little boy throwing things away and inuring himself to the inevitability of loss by playing this game, at least in Freud's interpretation, right? The difference between that and, again, these intrinsic creative processes of babbling, where you're essentially babbling or chattering, where you're essentially always generating this stochastic or undirected activity like babbling, and then seeing what sticks. You're kind of always palpating the world in all of these undirected ways, and direction, kind of telos, basically, will emerge in the interaction between that, and this is chaosmosis, right? The interaction between that chaotic, stochastic, whatever differential element of the system itself and something coming from the environment, which has similarly, stochastic and whatever origins as well. But when they come together, there's a selection effect that stabilizes some particular, way of being, way of doing things in a very contingent manner. I'm not sure if that all, hangs together. There's too many things to try and cover here. But again, instead of thinking about the Fort Da game as like death drive, it's more, this is what the life drive or the heterogenetic, ongoing process of novelty looks like in its encounter with the world. You start out just doing random things, and then maybe you get rewarded. Like, I've got a 3-year-old daughter. Why do kids like to play peekaboo? Is it because it's like some death drive phenomenon where they're somehow getting used to like their parent disappearing, behind the couch, and then they go, oh, it's great when they come back? or is it just because they get rewarded for doing that? We give them a reward every time they laugh. We are stimulated by that. We laugh too. We get happy, and then that game very rapidly gets associated with just the joy of a certain kind of relational interaction. Yeah,
like shit posting on Twitter and just randomly saying bullshit, and one particular post gets a lot of likes. That's the external exogenous stimulator, right?
Dude, what's the line from Anti-Oedipus Papers? The barter anything for everything. The barf out the
barf out the schizo flow or something.
The schizomaniacal flows or something like that. Like, yeah, no, it's no, that's.
I think the problem when we say a lot of these things, and I mean, it's like the problem people have had with Darwinian evolution is like, oh, well, how can you imagine that all this incredible structure and all this beautiful stuff and the endless forms most beautiful, to use Darwin's term, emerges from random activity? That's completely ridiculous. That's impossible. Like, it seems completely counterintuitive, and that does miss the crucially important role that the pre-existing structure that has already been deposited plays in canalizing that quote-unquote random activity. It's not just like all random all the time or something like that, but the generative process, the way new things come into the world, is essentially arbitrary, and it has to be, otherwise they're not new. They're just recapitulations, right? So there's you can be a bit Sartrean and say it's existence preceding essence or whatever, but this is the basic evolutionary insight. The basic Darwinian insight is that variation comes before selection, right? And that's why the Darwinian framework has the explanatory potential that it has, because if you posit the form, the principle of selection, or the whatever's being inherited as well, prior to the variation, you're begging the question, basically. You're explaining the forms that you see in terms of what I call an unexplained explainer, right? Something you can't itself explain in terms of that immanent process. So it becomes an eternal kind of absolute or whatever. And that, we could get into the discussion. I mean, maybe we should stick to Guattari, but we could get into the discussion of Ruyere and his themes in this regard, because he does have a really beautiful, organicist, morphogenetic philosophy. But it always seems to me, and I have only read his stuff that exists in translation, and even that I don't have eidetic recall of, but it always seems to me that the themes, they do a lot of work, but there is the sense that they are kind of eternal operators. They are kind of unexplained explainers. Like, they have a theme, like they have a form to them that is not itself really accountable for in terms of that immanent process of formation. That might be unfair to Ruyere, I don't know.
I like to think of it as, to bug Taylor, as determination in the last instance. Since
Nice.
you were making fun of me earlier this week, right? But it does, because that, I don't know, to me it recognizes, like you're saying, there's the, like, whatever the past or the pre-individual and the contingent kind of merge. So there's a determination, but not until that disruption occurs, right? Like, it's at that event, perhaps we could, I don't know, maybe that's being
I think
capricious, but
I like it, because I think that kind of actualization now is a coming to definiteness in a specific context, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so there's to me, and this is like an issue that I take with Whitehead, but there's no definiteness outside, like prior to that, like quote unquote final moment of actualization of a particular like determinate or definite form. And to imagine that there is, and you can critique me in my deployment of a Deleuzian concept here, or earlier it's Bergsonian, I suppose, as well. But to imagine that there is definiteness prior to that is transcendental illusion, basically, is to confuse the product of a process of, like, an immanent process of formation with that which makes it possible or which pre-existed. So in a sense, that's the way I take the critique of the conflation of the virtual and the possible to work. Mm-hmm. Like, possibilities are kind of quasi-determinate, like they have a certain definiteness to them. But I would say that they only have that definiteness in relationship to their adjacency to some actual situation. Whereas the virtual, which obviously does a lot of things, it's another one of these very polysemous terms, and Guattari seems to be doing interesting things with it when you get to the analysis of his fourfold, but is in itself not determinate in any sense, right? Like if you were thinking about pure difference or whatever, there's a virtuality that is not preformed, and is not to be confused with a possibility, because a possibility has a kind of quasi-definite or quasi-determinate shape or form to it.
One of the ways in which I think Guattari may get away with using the possible, even after Deleuze spent those key pages in Difference and Repetition critiquing the notion, following Bergson, is what you were saying there, and this relying on this this notion of like the smoothing of time, right? So that an invention changes the future and the past irrevocably, irreversibly. It's this singularization or resingularization that he's talking about. And that for him itself implies the creation of new possible universes of reference and value. So there is a sense in which, instead of being opposed, the virtual and the possible are almost not synonymous, but perhaps they are conspiring together in a way that the actual is sort of helping to move forward. So, and I think this is similar to the differences, if we want to emphasize them, between Simondon and Guattari, where Simondon, as you were rightly pointing out, Tim, is on not just biology, but that's one of the sciences he's drawing upon very strongly in order to repurpose these notions to have a means of communicating these disparate orders of philosophy and science. With Guattari, as he says at the beginning of this book, and as he said elsewhere, look, we're not doing science. We don't have to have that burden of proof that scientists do, because we are proceeding in a different discursive conjunction that forgoes the rules of a certain classical logic or a certain rigor and exactitude that science demands, and that philosophy cannot, can only clumsily try to give, but only by betraying itself, right? I think that Guattari is not necessarily. This is why he wants to move us from, as the subtitle of the book of Chaosmosis, suggests, away from, the whether it be even the human or social sciences or the sciences in general, to this ethico-aesthetic paradigm, right? This is the emphasis, the refrain that he wants to play out, and that gives him a certain, I think, freedom from the demands of scientific rigor that Simondon is not willing to forego. Because Simondon himself, even if he ends, as I said, in this conclusion, the sort of culmination point is this articulation of at least some ethical insights that he's drawn from his research into individuation, but he's gotten there by means of science. And I think that Guattari is taking a different route, which doesn't mean they have to be opposed. It's just that the means that they are mobilizing are obviously going to be quite different.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is really fascinating, though, is the way that the kind of ethico-aesthetic paradigm, when you loop it back onto, say, like the kind of empirical biological realities that I study and work with, which, I'm trying to traverse, a lot of my work and teaching as well, everything from the way organisms, again, are kind of manipulating or mediating their relationships with other organisms using chemistry, all the way through to the human relationship with drugs. And that becomes a big, the role of society and norms, laws, and branding, as I call it. Like, is this a drug, or is it a pharmaceutical? Is it a healing context in which we're using it? Is it a recreational context? Is this a drug of abuse or a treatment for drug abuse? Like you look at the rebranding of psychedelics in recent times, crossing that boundary in really interesting ways. And when I do the kind of diagrammatic move, I don't really think, and maybe this is just me being some kind of crypto reductionist, but then it's diagramming, so there's a reductionist element to it, but it's a reductionism in terms of principles, again, not structures, principles and operations. What's really fascinating is that a lot of those operators can be pretty readily mapped onto one another. And I think this is what Guattari is trying to do with his ontology. But where am I going with this? When you loop the ethico-aesthetic paradigm back onto even the things that are going on in kind of non-human nature, it actually it squares in interesting ways, right? And it ends up perhaps revealing things that are or were more difficult to see if one were insisting on certain, like, say, elements of classical logic that you're saying science has to be beholden to. But you can do the same thing by just doing a kind of history of scientific practice itself. Like if you deconstruct some of the, tacit assumptions of the mainstream, let's say majoritarian or whatever, lineages of scientific practice and the formalisms that are deeply embedded in the scientific worldview, and coming out of the so-called mechanical philosophy. I mean, here we obviously have this interesting comparison between mechanism or the mechanical philosophy really and machinism, which is interesting. But if you deconstruct all of that kind of stuff, you can get out from under the hegemony of a lot of things that are considered to be quote unquote science. And you can actually do that by just giving a closer attention to the empirical details of some of these systems and just seeing that, like, well, this doesn't really seem deterministic to me, for example, right? I couldn't possibly understand this in terms of a pre-existing state space or something like that. Like I have to see that these systems are generating actually novel things. So basically, I couldn't understand this in terms of a Laplacian paradigm in which ultimately everything is going to be pushed back onto the initial conditions and entailing laws, right? I could say that. I could be like, oh, well, look, this is not inconsistent with that. So it's fine. This is science, guys. It's totally consistent with this Laplacian paradigm. But again, if you're doing the historical investigation into that as itself a contingent product of a particular, lineage of human thought, which is deeply theological, which again is neither here nor there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but entailing laws have a lot of similarities with omnipotent creators. And you can map the Laplacian paradigm onto the Platonic operators pretty easily, like forms and demiurge, and doing all of that kind of thing is a way of creating these degrees of freedom. But you can stay, in my opinion, into very close contact with what I consider to be science, anyway. And part of that is this oscillatory movement between a very, very close and as high fidelity as possible attention to the empirical details of a system that one is studying, and then a shifting from that level to this diagrammatic level of principles, and so mathematical models, computational models, whatever it might be, but continue, like, not giving one of those levels the final say, essentially, and certainly not letting the formalisms tell you what's happening with the empirical givens that you just simply can't extract from them, because if you view again those formalisms as a kind of contingent structures that are themselves again the products of certain machinic assemblages, then you get a different kind of view. And I think so what's interesting is that the degrees of freedom that people like Deleuze and Guattari allow themselves by saying, well, we're not doing science, we are, like magpies or bowerbirds, we're prolifically appropriating, co-opting scientific principles and thought forms in this inexact way, but we're not going to be beholden to certain strictures which might be associated with their use in scientific terms. I think you actually do, again, when you take the product of that and look back onto some of these scientific disciplines through that lens, you end up with something that, well, to be honest, I feel like I got there without Deleuze and Guattari. Like what I find when I read Deleuze and Guattari is like fellow travelers in some sense, that just by paying a lot of attention to the evolutionary dynamics of chemical ecological systems, and of course, reading process philosophers like Whitehead and Peirce, and of course, they're influential on Deleuze and Guattari. So there's lots of shared sources of ideas here, perhaps. But reading Darwin, you can end up in a kind of similar space is all that I'm trying to say. And there's plenty of what we consider to be science that should be critiqued in these more philosophical terms, but not for the sake of having a philosophical paradigm necessarily that floats free of that or has degrees of freedom that doesn't have, but also for an immanent critique of scientific practice itself.
All of that gives a lot of context to that divide, and definitely doesn't downplay science. What I will say, I know we're at the hour and a half mark, so perhaps for a little bit of fun, Coop, you were mentioning you saw some Dune analogies in the did you want to bring out one of those for a little bit of, if we can, for a moment, do something light?
Yeah, I mean, I might consider like that example that I've been bringing up in the last few episodes about from Dune, the first novel, where they're having the conversation with the water seller and like the imperial ecologist about how the Fremen drink the blood of the dead, and their whole like the whole discussion of the ethical system, because we have this water seller having this kind of ethical outlook that is based on a transcendent rule, like, oh, we should respect this, like the blood of the dead, right? We shouldn't consume that, versus the way that the Fremen develop their practice, or their ethical paradigm of a man's flesh belongs to him, but his water belongs to the tribe, right? And that ethic really is a positive feedback loop on their reproductive capacity as a group, as an entity, as a living society, right? So I think that's just a great example of, I don't know, a more imminent ethics, more imminent way of doing things that, right? Because like, if you look at this from a just like purely pragmatic standpoint, right? Like if they didn't perform this practice, they would die off, right? So holding these ideals above the actual lived experience of our lives and necessities of like contingency and so forth, how that just leads to sort of bad outcomes, I think, ultimately. And I think that would be a good example of ecosophy, or even really, well, I guess ecosophy, yeah, for that one. Now, I had another example of like chaosmosis per se from Dune as well, would be the reverence for Shai-Hulud and amongst the Fremen, because Shai-Hulud, right, is like sort of a chaotic death machine, we could say, right? Because you never know where one might show up and could wreak havoc, could kill your whole tribe, could destroy your home, could destroy your food, etc., right? But the way that the Fremen come to revere this sort of chaotic element, and it becomes a, I don't know, sort of a suture for their kind of like cultural, ethical relationship to their planet. I think kind of fits the chaosmotic model of that. Yeah, like really harnessing the chaotic to bring order. There's a structure that gets built on this chaotic, uh, you know, biological phenomenon. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, they're adapted obviously to their context. I wonder if they almost have neutralized the chaotic element of Shai-Hulud to some
right?
degree.
Yeah, they really have because I mean, if you think they use it for, I mean, I guess the machinic phyla too, the way they use the worms for transport, the teeth of the worm for knives, etc. So it's not just in the kind of non-material realm; it's also in their full on in terms of their tools and transportation and so forth, and also
It's-
really and their religion too. Like their metaphysics is all tied up in, or really, I mean, I guess maybe not metaphysics, but like I was thinking about the spice orgy as more like their kind of method of dealing with libidinal economy, right?
Mm,
Because there's such a regimented, you can't cry, you can't,
mm,
I mean, they live such really regimented lives that are extremely pragmatic, and they have the Amtal rule, which is kind of like we're going to test something to its like absolute limit, which oftentimes means it's death, right? So the stakes of their lives are incredibly high. So how they deal with that is by having the spice orgies where the libidos can kind of like they can like have that release valve and
mm.
bring the community closer and so forth. They're kind of a depersonalizing process, like creating a body without organs. I think ultimately the way the barriers between the individuals kind of dissolve and they kind of become one active libido or what have you. But
Yeah,
that's
I
a
mean,
lot.
yeah. Well, I guess the spice orgy thing. I mean, it does have fairly trivial analogies to a kind of collective, obviously drug taking ceremony in which, yeah, maybe body without organs are achieved via a certain disruption of a set of norms that are normally instantiated in order to help them survive in their daily lives. I wonder though if they really discover anything new in that process, right? If it's a release, but is it actually generative?
Well,
Is
I think
it
so, yeah, because they actually the Fremen, I think, they by imbibing the spice, they get prescience. They don't get prescience in the way that Paul does or any of the Kwisatz Haderach do, but they have a sort of limited prescience, and I think so. Perhaps that can be the kind of actual utility of it
but
beyond
isn't it
just libido.
one one of the really fascinating things about prescience in that world is that it actually becomes a mode of preformationism. So that something new is discovered, but in some sense, when it goes to the Kwisatz Haderach degree with Paul and Leto the second or the third, with the missing second. Um, those guys, I mean, it's eventually revealed, right, that in some sense they don't foresee the future so much as manifest the future,
Right.
uh, that they become these like over-determining attractors that completely canalize. So they actually function like eternal forms in some interesting way, or like the Laplacian combination
Right.
of initial conditions and entailing laws, where there might be some kind of heterogenetic process, but it happens all at once. Actually, Peirce talks about this, when he's debating people who deny the kind of reality of an evolutionary cosmology or an evolutionary metaphysics, and he's like, well, you might believe that there's some creative process, but you're saying that it happens all at once in at the beginning of time, or whatever, however you conceptualize the absolute initial conditions, whereas I'm saying it's he doesn't say it in exactly this way, but like it's an imminent process that is always ongoing, and never exhausted. And I guess there's some sense, I mean, I'm only just being devil's advocate, but there's some sense in which Paul, Leto too, they had some very creative vision, but then they just shut down or the vast majority of the imminent heterogenetic process through the power of their kind of one and done
Right.
creative vision. The thing with the Shai-Hulud is really interesting because, yeah, I think the worms have obviously dictated the way that the Fremen can occupy space, the way that they can live in those environments, where they can and can't live. And they're not setting up settlements in places that like Shai-Hulud is going to come and destroy them, right? So it's like in the later books, what's that girl's name? There's that whole story about how her village gets destroyed. She becomes the next
Shiana, yeah.
Yeah. But that's already a way that Fremen are, quote unquote, Fremen are living in this kind of bastardized way because, colonialization or whatever, colonization has distorted their relationship with the land, where they used to live in the sieges are all set up in permanent rock formations and things where Shai-Hulud can't go. And then the relationship that they actually, the living relationship that they have with Shai-Hulud is kind of like, they're not really scared of them or anything, are they?
They revere them.
They revere them, but they manipulate them, right? They in some sense they revere them, but they've also taken control over them. They attract them with the thumpers. They have expert methods of riding them. They also get their drugs from them. They take the babies and they get the spice liquor from. The whole thing is a kind of. They've neutralized it. They've had to initially adapt to it to some degree. Where do they put their settlements? But otherwise, they've sort of neutralized that chaotic element in their environment. And I suppose part of what I'm trying to say with some of the chemical ecology examples is that there is no final, neutralization in that sort of sense. There are different strategies that organisms have between, broadly speaking, generalized strategies, which are kind of all about one's capacity to basically be plastic and adapt to lots of different exogenous environments. And there are specialist strategies where you and that would correspond to a sort of Simondonian hypertele.
Right. Yeah.
You go all in on a particular strategy, and that can be very successful for a certain period of time. But then when that environment changes, it's very, very vulnerable to, specialists are the first ones to go extinct when humans come in with the bulldozers, right? I don't know if there's some parallel there.
Yeah, I struggle to think of a good one, but I keep going back to this, how I think it would be so fortuitous, or not fortuitous, but I think valuable to go back and look at Deleuze's What is Grounding, because I think, what you point to with respect to the problem of prescience and how it begins to sort of it becomes the grounding for the possibilities, right? And then it constrains possibility and adaptation by this singular vision, right? So I think, I don't know, that's just an interest. And I wanted to mention that back to, I forget what Taylor forget the specific thing you were mentioning, but I don't know, the conditions of possibility and that continual reset sort of process, grounding in that sense, I don't know, seems like an interesting thing to chase up in Deleuze's early work.
I kind of feel, I have a critique here, and I'm absolutely no Deleuze or Guattari or whatever scholar, but when you read, it'd be interesting to get Taylor's position on this, actually, because when I read Bergson's Conception of Difference, which I think is a 1956 Deleuze essay, there's a tendency there. It's actually, that's not intended to be a pun, but because it's all about tendencies to some degree. But there, he explicitly substantializes difference. He says difference is substance. And he also uses tendencies in this kind of Bergsonian, Ruyerian way, as though they are essentially preformed. And I think there are some potential issues there, because those might be novel conceptions of grounds, but they are still an attempt to do that more classical, to engage in that more classical exercise of grounding, which I fully admit is very, very difficult to escape from. But I think, one of the differences, and maybe this feels like anyway, it's where Deleuze and Guattari go. And correct me if you think Deleuze is already there with this, but is away from, and actually Simondon is also interesting in this regard, because I think, on the one hand, and this resonates with something that Rocco Gangle was saying in your chat a little while ago, on the one hand, we can conceive of the pre-individual as this radical firstness, like a field, a pre-individual field with tensions and gradients and things, but no determinate, definite individual states that all individuals emerge from. And then there's a tendency from that vision to move in the direction of a kind of substantializing of that field, or treating it as a kind of reductive base where everything in some sense would reduce to just some kind of more or less stable or metastable perturbation in that fundamental field. And that would be the kind of reductionism we'd see in certain visions of quantum cosmologies and things like that. And I think there's a way that, we want to have a vision a little bit like that, but also to avoid feeling the need to posit some absolutely primary substance. And I think Simondon maybe avoids that. Like, I don't think he thinks that the question of cosmogenesis, like absolute origins of everything, is a meaningful question where there's, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, where in Peirce and Whitehead, for example, there's a very explicit compulsion need to engage that question, like how does it all begin? And initially Peirce wants to say it does begin with this pure firstness, this germinal nothing, and then he kind of gets a bit scared off from that view by people criticizing him and saying, well, if you believe that habits can form, you're saying that there's always already a tendency to form habits, which is always already a kind of incipient thirdness. So you have to say actually either firstness, secondness, and thirdness are co-primordial, or maybe you even want to say thirdness is first, and that's the way certain more Christian theological readings of Peirce go. Thirdness is first, and thirdness is the mind of God. But I think there's this tension to be held here between like when we're trying to really think in these kind of difference first ontologies, and even Whitehead has his creativity first. Peirce, in some incarnations has his firstness first. We want to maybe hold on to that as a kind of explanatory and methodological stricture that you can never explain any given form solely in terms of like a pre-existing form that it is either a copy of or is absolutely constrained by. You want to start like Darwin with variation first, coming into the world in a kind of semi-unconstrained way or an operationally unconstrained way. Unconstrained relative to the explanatory desideratum, because it could still be constrained in other ways, and proceed from that without necessarily trying to think about the absolute origin of everything. So, which is the exercise of grounding in some sense, right? Is the foundationalist move. But then I have this compulsion to think absolute origins in some sense, and I feel like we also have to do that. At least in this kind of apophatic mode where we would be looking at options there and seeing that, I guess, that they're all antinomies in some sense, right? So maybe it's a slightly Kantian move, but saying that, it will be, origins are always underdetermined in the same way that the future is always underdetermined. And so in just bog standard evolutionary biology, we reconstruct ancestral states on the basis of extant variation. So we infer ancestral states based on things that we have access to. But I think we generally know, or we should always remember, that the further we look back on any given, evolutionary lineage, its origins, its determinate origins are going to recede over some kind of horizon. And so we'll only be able to think about origins in the most abstract or diagrammatic sense. And to me, that's going to have us fall back on a kind of, an abstract diagram, a set of principles that doesn't accord to a determinate origin or a substantialized ground.
Oh, this is good. And honestly, there were a couple of key moments where it felt like you were culminating the entirety of the discussion and giving us the outro without being prompted. It would be hard to be able to respond to any one of the points, but I do think you're right about that 56 essay on Bergson, which is the same year of the course on what is grounding, which I think Coop we're going to look at next week, right? So at least that was per your proposal, I believe, right?
Yeah, actually, I'll be out of town next weekend, but
Okay,
I think
so
the
2 weeks.
following week, yeah.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now. And so I think that the 56 essay on Bergson, which functions, you could see like it's, I think that your points are correct, and it's interesting that that essay, he actually got two essays on Bergson in 56, right? And he actually makes some pretty key shifts between them. And so I've always wondered if one of them is him trying to articulate Bergson, let Bergson speak through his own mouth. And then I think the other uh, Bergson essay is a little bit more Deleuze. But even in these 50s era, right? It's a question. I wonder if he's yet figured out the method of buggery like he will. Maybe that's part of the the little bit of hiatus he has between the Hume book and the Nietzsche book. Something definitely shifts in that 9 year period, and I do think part of it is the relation to Bergson and how informative it is for the rest of his understanding of things like transcendental empiricism and these other aspects. But yeah, I mean, so much of what you've brought out today, Tim, is great. It is interesting. We focused on the chapter machine heterogeneousness and really like a key moment, and we're able to use that as the springboard to bring in a lot of these considerations, a lot of the stuff that you've been engaging in your field and outside of it, and your own philosophical studies. And I think that it just kind of shows the breadth and depth of this work and of Guattari's work, where insofar as he's an idea thief, I also think he wants us to steal his ideas and take what works and leave behind what doesn't yet work or doesn't really like fit at the moment. And that really does make him a kind of accelerator, for these other vantage points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we barely touched on Chaosmosis really, but it is such a rich work. But maybe in some sense, I mean, we didn't get to the fourfold ontology, but it can be reduced, not in an eliminative way, obviously, but to a kind of core set of principles. I think some of which we've managed to articulate anyway. So the two Bergson essays you're thinking of, right, are the ones that are back to back in Desert
Yeah,
Island.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's an interesting shift between the two of them, as though one almost like immediately caused a break with the other. And Sabignard points this out in her chapter on Bergson and in her book on transcendental empiricism. And so I would have to like look at that and figure out the best way to articulate it. But it may relate to your critiques of this, whether it be the play of differences, substance, or whatnot. That would be something we would have to return to. But it's a good food for thought. I mean, I liked what you said about Deleuze and Guattari as fellow travelers. I do think that that's part of the strength of their work, is how they often are spinning out all these different lines of flight that act as these like light speed portals that to achieve that infinite speed of thought, so to speak. And you never come back. You always come back transformed, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, they I think to your point earlier, they give themselves a certain kind of latitude, and that becomes very generative. And then I think that they are also, I mean, to your point, or resonating with you bringing up Anne's book that you've recently translated, and which I really need to get to reading. They're empirical. They are empiricists in a very strong way as well. So, I mean, and maybe in different ways, each of them, but they are very closely connected to actual, maybe that's not a word I should use, but, to concrete, not necessarily just material, but situations. And I feel like they're always doing that oscillation. They are trying to do justice to the appearances in some sense, to the givens, without reducing them, of course, to these sorts of transcendent or transcendental schematisms. But nonetheless, that is a big part of the thought too. Hence, transcendental empiricism. I'll have to read. Actually, I don't think I've ever read that other Bergson essay from '56. So I'll have to read that and make the comparison that you are suggesting. Because I guess what I'm trying to get at there is that when we try to substantialize difference in this way, we are we're still insisting on putting it back into this kind of classical conception, which is ultimately hierarchical, right? So we haven't escaped that Aristotelian or Porphyrian scheme there, the tree scheme. And I mean, there are, I mean, as they say, but obviously, as I'm going to say, as an evolutionary biologist, there are places for trees. But trying to ground everything. And I don't think I've read that "What is Grounding" essay either. So I think I'll be really interested to hear your episode on that, and perhaps I will also read that in parallel. Like, do we need to ground things? I think when I was speaking about cosmogenesis and the way people like Whitehead and Peirce do try to explicitly engage that problem, and then of course the way it is explicitly engaged in science, in the science of cosmology. Although it is and it isn't, because the past hypothesis, this inexplicably low entropy state of the early universe and stuff, is a way of kind of cutting off investigation at a certain point. I think we do need to engage that thought. Like, I think when we are anti-foundationalists, or we are affirming a groundless ground or whatever, and we're saying that there are no absolute relata prior to these relational networks. So there's a kind of horizontality in the thought, right? That all relata or relata are the products of other relations, essentially, and that there's no real need to try and get behind that whole process and say, well, what's the thing that everything is those relations are initially emerging in, or what are the two things that have the first relationship, or something like that. But I think when we just brush that, so I think we don't want to end up there, but I also think when we just brush that under the rug, we again risk importing or smuggling in certain kind of tacit assumptions about grounding into our thought. Like, if we've not explicitly engaged the thought of grounding or tried to think about how the whole thing begins. So I don't know where I'm at with that, to be honest, because I keep getting pulled back to that question. But what I want to say is that, yes, I don't want to have this ultimate, reductive base of everything or whatever, but I want to think things through in that way, at least from time to time, to understand what consequences the kind of model that I'm otherwise affirming might have, and that might be kind of tacitly buried in it because of my refusal to consider that in some way. But then it becomes like an exercise in negative theology or apophaticism or something, that you, like, every time you go there, you're recognizing that you're never going to determine that state in some way. You're just probing those limits to understand what can't work, or what would have like undesirable consequences elsewhere in your thought if you were affirming that kind of view.
You still with us, Taylor? Wonder if we lost it.
Sorry, no, my headset was off.
Okay, gotcha.
So I was saying that the 56, the "What is Grounding," that is a lecture course he gave, and there's a interesting history that was preserved. That's the same year of the Bergson essay. So I think that what Coop and I will do is move from "What is Grounding" to maybe dipping into some of difference or repetition. I'd have to figure out how we would pull that off and curate it, but that's where Deleuze comes up with his own neologism for ungrounding. And I think that it'd be interesting to put that into dialogue and move directly to ungrounding and difference of repetition, in order to really get the most out of moving from asking what is grounding to then proposing this kind of metaphysical ontological ungrounding that is required to think, to provide difference with its own concept, as he seeks. So that's like provisional stuff that we can look at, and I will obviously, Tim, you and I will be discussing a lot of that and more as we move on. And I know we could probably talk for another 6-7 hours at this rate, because we've, as we said, we only scratched the surface. But I think it was important to highlight this section and see what we built off. It was a nice little kernel, a nice little nucleus. So Tim, man, thank you for joining us. I know it was early morning for you over there in Australia, and I appreciate you getting up at the break of dawn to.
But you came out guns blazing, so to speak. Pretty impressive, blazing. I have to say.
Oh man, it's going to be fun listening back and being able to talk through with some of these points with you, Tim. So thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and hopefully I didn't overcompensate for my tiredness and the recency of the caffeine imbibing by coming out, so to speak.
Yeah, a little bit of you had a little bit of the toxins of the caffeine and the second wind, right? That itself is a toxin in a good way, right? So these were all good discussions.
Yeah, by now that I'm I'm an excitable character. So
all right, Tim.
Yeah. No, I love what you're saying about I'm looking forward to hearing you guys talk about what is grounding, and I'll definitely have a look at that in the background. And I think we might circle back, Taylor, also to Jean-Jacques Kupiec at some point.
Yeah, I owe you that discussion before making you read Sauvignar's work. So we will definitely be doing that, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk to.
We'll have to bring you back to riff on Dune shit in a more organized way, because I think since you've actually read the books,
yeah, I'm not a filthy cat.
You could add some real good, some more rigorous. You know what I mean?
I would be down for that.
Some more rigorous riffs, so to speak.
I always want to do something that grows out of all the epigraphs. Like that, to me, that's just the best thing in Dune.
Oh yeah, I think the epigraphs from children, in particular, I really loved quite a bit.
Okay, I'll have to go back to them specifically. I think I've said to you before, Coop.
But they are all good usually, but those I think were the best.
They're so pithy, and I think a book. Can't believe there isn't one still of just the epigraphs.
Yeah, there you go. All right, Coop. I appreciate you hosting, my friend.
Yeah.
I need to head to the store, but it looks like we have an idea of what to do 2 weeks from now, and so we'll
call it a wrap here. Thanks for joining us on another exciting adventure on the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. To the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.